Many thanks for joining us in one slot. My name is Rita Omodia. Now, from the transatlantic slave trade to colonialism and post-colonialism, Africa has always been a continent of interest for many Western powers. Are these Western powers actually in the true interest of Africa and Africans, or are they there to exploit the continent? These and many more will be explored on today's episode of One Slot, where Russia, in a concerted campaign to gain influence on the African continent over the last decade, will be examined. These engagements extend from deepening ties in North Africa, expanding its reach in the Central African Republic and South Africa. While drawing the world's attention with its aggressive stance towards Ukraine, the former Soviet power's strengthened ties with Africa has raised concerns in the Western world. On the other hand, France tries to regain lost ties with its colonial allies. On today's One Slot, we examine Russia's growing influence in Africa and its straight ties with France. Is it of benefit to Africa, or should Africa be wary of these geostrategic interests? Stay with us in One Slot. We will be right back. Now, joining us for this conversation is Professor Gordon Zide, a Pan-Africanist, retired Vice-Chancellor and Principal of the Vaal University of Technology and the current CEO and founder of Jigel TPT Limited. He joins us from Vanderbijl Park, Gauteng, South Africa. Thank you so much, Professor, for joining us on this conversation.
Thank you very much.
Now, if we're looking at Russia's relations with France, I mean, before we go back to historical perspective, let's look at what is happening right now. And contemporary Russia has pushed a narrative of being a natural ally to African states, one that respects their sovereignty in contrast to neo-imperialist Western meddling. Now, Professor, how much does this resonate with African leaders, and are there still skepticism to this agenda?
Yeah, well, thank you very much for this opportunity to share with the audience and with you, some perspectives regarding Russia's interest in Africa, particularly in the present day socio-economic and political development. First and foremost, I think we really need to recognize that Russia historically never colonized any part of Africa. And so the interest which Russia shows in Africa, I would probably say, for a want of a better term, that it is some form of reparation, because the European countries, at least some of them, like the Germany of this world, the France of this world, as well as the Italy and Portugal, were the colonizers. That's why we've got African countries which speak France and Spanish and all of that. But as far as Russia is concerned, there has always been a political relationship between Russia and South Africa. Even during the days of the struggle against apartheid, Russia has always been a friend of anti-apartheid struggles. We would recall that the late acting president of the ANC, Oliver Tambo, approached Russia for assistance during the times of apartheid, and that assistance was granted, particularly in terms of military training of some of the MK cadres of the ANC. And so there is that kind of relationship between South Africa in particular and Russia. And so I think that it's a relationship built on sound brotherhood and probably also sound moral grounds, certainly for Russia, as well as South Africa. And let me just conclude this part of the contribution by saying that morally speaking, I think Russia has got that responsibility to respect the sovereignty of South Africa, as well as to influence, if it can, some commercial and economic relations, which would go a long way in stabilizing the economy of the country.
All right, now, Professor, you talked about the French anti-apartheid struggle. Now, just to get a landscape, how much of influence or how much has Russia infiltrated into Africa? I mean, you talk about the reason that Russia has never colonized Africa. How deep is Russia into Africa?
Well, Russia is really deep into Africa. Remember, I said that this is perhaps some kind of reparation, given the fact that Russia never colonized any part of South Africa, except, of course, if we remember, it had some role in influencing Abuja. Abuja was one of those, but never has there been a state within Africa which can rightly say it was colonized by Russia. And so I think the interest which Russia now shows in Africa is both a moral interest as well as a commercial interest. So the two, in my view, go hand in hand. That is why there is that kind of interest, which I believe that if Russia did not show that kind of interest, it would probably reverse the gains which have already been made since the days of Oliver Tambo as the acting president of the African National Congress, which approached Russia for military training. So this is a continuous relationship built on those foundational principles of anti-apartheid struggle.
You talk about moral and commercial interest that Russia has. What exactly has Africa gained from Russia, or is it just one-sided?
I don't think that it is one-sided. Evidently, when two parties are, that there's a language which says that it takes two to tango. So when people are dancing, you can dance, on your own, but there has to be a partner with whom to dance. So there is diplomatic relations which would be established between Africa, some countries in Africa, as well as Russia. So it's going to be a mutually beneficial relationship, where, for instance, if we can take on an academic a point of view, some of our African students could be trained in Russia, and be exposed to how things are done in Russia for the benefit of Africa. So that exchange program between Russia and Africa will certainly be beneficial to Africa as well as to Russia, because we cannot assume that Russia is a superpower and therefore it will not gain any benefit in its relationship with Africa. It will certainly gain relations. And then, of course, it will remove this whole notion of Africa being a receiving continent all the time, with Western powers imposing themselves on Africa, as if the beauty and the intelligentsia of the world rest with Western powers. Far from it. Africa has always been a cradle of knowledge, a cradle of information. And so the beauty between these diplomatic relations will be beneficial to the two countries, as it were. Like, for instance, in terms of military, in terms of education, and in terms of health facilities. So it will be beneficial.
We're going to go deeper into this beneficial segments, talking about education, talking about military, talking about economy. But I wonder, Professor Zide, do you think that this so-called relationship between Russia and Africa, that Russia is trying to see it as a way to lure the continent? I mean, you say that Africa is is not necessarily a collecting state, but we see lots of Western powers all rushing to get the resources of Africa. So do you see this as a ploy for Russia to try and lure the continent from Western powers or Western influence?
Let's put it this way. It may appear that Russia is attempting to lure the African countries, but we really need to be very careful in locating its influence simply as a one-sided kind of relationship. I did indicate earlier on that we need to move away from the notion which suggests that Africa is a dark continent. Without Western influence, Africa would not have existed. But let us remember, even historically, that civilization really started in Africa. And so we really need to understand and appreciate that Africa has got a lot to contribute towards the development of the world. And having said that, we need to accept and understand that for the Western world's own interest, it not only conquered Africa, but it also colonized some parts of Africa. But Russia, I think I'm repeating myself here, Russia did not. And so coming over now, exerting its influence, is not necessarily an issue of Russia coming in to say, look, we're better than some parts of Europe. It's going to be a beneficial. And I would like you to probe more into the economic nature. That's why I said the relationship is both moral, military, but also commercial. I think it is important to understand that we've got something to offer as Africa, much as Russia has got something to offer. So it takes two to tango.
Russia definitely has something to offer. We've seen that military with the Wagner Group, a private company. We've also seen France at the other side also trying to help Africa. I mean, talk about commercial and military. We've seen France and its other colonial allies, Mali, Burkina Faso and Guinea. But we've also seen recent growing anti-French sentiments. For example, what do you think is the reason for this growing sentiment? And do you think that this will also resonate with the relationship that is growing with Russia?
Absolutely. But also, if we're looking at France is trying to repair the damage which it had done historically. And so it will use any opportunity to try and repair that damage, but not for Russia. Russia as a state is saying, look, we are here to partner openly now, with Africa, given our history as Russia. And so it is important not necessarily to compare the diplomatic relations between Africa and Russia as well as Africa with France. I think we'll be comparing oranges with apples. It is my view that it is very, very important to distinguish between Russia and France. France has got its own agenda, and as you would know, there are many French-speaking countries in Africa which were colonized by France. And so France has got its own agenda, which agenda is not the same as that of Russia. So there is no resonance. There is no resonance between Russia's influence in Africa as well as France's influence in Africa.
Professor Zide, I really want you to talk about that. I mean, why would you say that France's agenda is different? They're all trying to help in the commercial, military and economy. So why would you say that the agenda is different? What exactly distinguishes France's relationship with Africa and Russia's relationship with Africa?
I said earlier on, remember that France had a footprint in Africa in terms of its colonization policy. It had a footprint in Africa. And in fact, up till now, France has not paid any reparation. So that's why I'm still saying France has got its own agenda, because it was one of the colonizers. And yet Russia did not colonize. And I think that's why I'm saying Russia's influence on Africa, in my view, I may be wrong, in my view, it is more diplomatic, it is more commercial, and it's got a moral obligation, which moral obligation started even during the days of Oliver Tambo as the president of the African National Congress. And so for me, that's exactly where the point is. that this Russia, South Africa or Africa relationship is very key. Like, for instance, I mean, you showed the photos of the Pan-Africanist president, but what was very interesting in the photos that you showed of Kwame Nkrumah, Julius Nyerere, and many others, you did not show the photo, for instance, of Gaddafi, Fidel Castro, and even our own Nelson Mandela and Steve Biko, as well as Robert Sobukwe. I found that very missing because these are leaders which South Africa boasts about. And we cannot allow a situation where the world and the continent does not recognize such formidable leaders which South Africa actually had. And one of whom, of course, as I say, Nelson Mandela himself acknowledged Russia, as well as O.R. Tambo. So that is the role that Russia has been playing and continues to play. And I want to believe that even post 2024, when our general elections take place, that relationship will still be there.
At this, I'm going to bring in a Stockholm International Peace Research Institute between 2017 and 2021. We're looking at Russia's relationship with Africa. Now, it said Moscow accounted for 44% of Africans' weapons purchases. Now, we have countries like Sudan, Syria, Mozambique, the Central African Republic, Libya, and Mali. So what exactly has been your assessment of Russia's military support in Africa?
Very great. I think Russia coming in support of, remember, Russia has really been against apartheid, particularly in South Africa. And where the military request has been coming forth to Russia from some of the African countries, Russia would consider it prudent to help as best it could, without necessarily imposing itself on a particular country. But if request does come for military assistance, then absolutely, based on moral principles respecting a sovereignty of that particular country, Russia would come in and assist because it is based on that moral request and moral authority and obligation. So I don't think that it's a question of Russia superimposing itself, but it's a question of Russia being requested to assist where it could. Like, for instance, a request which came from the ANC. And so Russia, based on that request, did come on board and assist in one way or the other, bringing apartheid to its knees.
France was also requested. I mean, if you look at Mali, you talk about that Russia did not superimpose itself on African countries, but France also was requested by these African countries to help them with the security situations going on. So isn't that still the same thing?
Remember, I said that for as long as a foreign country respects and acknowledges the sovereignty of a particular country, it is the responsibility of a country which requests assistance, then that country come in. But where I would disagree, it's, for instance, a country which would, a foreign country, which would come to Libya and superimposes itself and murders the president of Libya under the guise of removing a despot. I would certainly not support that, because that is, in my view, superimposition. But if France was requested by a country in Africa, then it's fine, because the request comes from Africa. But it is not a question of France coming in uninvited to come and superimpose itself. That would be a big problem. There must be a recognition of the sovereignty of a particular country, because this bully mentality, it should not be encouraged at all. You know, I refer here, for instance, to what happened in Libya, you know, under the guise of removing a despot, and Muammar Gaddafi was brutally murdered. It cannot be correct. Now, you begin to ask yourself, where is the moral authority? Where is the moral obligation of a country simply coming in, purporting to be promoting peace and justice, and in the same vein, it kills people willy-nilly? It cannot be right. But if, for instance, it was Libya itself which requests another country to come in, and there is profound evidence that indeed this was a request which came from Libya, not some wishy-washy kind of request, then I would say it's fine. But this is my view.
There has still been skepticism of Russia's military alliance with a lot of African countries. And so far, we've seen a lot of that happening with situations where there's a military coup. I mean, in the past year, we've seen coups in Mali, we've seen in Guinea, in Burkina Faso. I mean, where do we place the relationship? Because it seems in those countries, we're seeing a lot of anti-French sentiments, and then we're seeing more relationship with Russia. Is there more of like a drawing line between these military coups and they're looking for assistance with Russia?
You see, this is a very interesting one. If you're looking at these military coups, the question that one needs to ask oneself is whether or not these military coups are in fact manipulated or are in fact influenced by external forces. In many than one instances, you will find that military coups are the influence of a third party, which would want to come into a country for its own material gains. But there is evidence which suggests that in some of the so-called military coups, it has not been really the people themselves who would, act against a particular government, but there has always been an agenda that, these securocrats would go in there and say, let's remove X from power. And then Y would say, we will come in, help you remove X on condition that we are going to get something of that military assistance. It has happened. I mean, there are so many instances which we can mention, but I'm not going to mention them now because we are on TV. But, the military coups are really engineered by securocrats, by people who have their own vested interests. And as soon as they assume leadership positions, then it's only then that, it's a question of, I help you rub my back, I rub your back, and then let's see what the outcome of this relationship is going to be. But as far as Russia is concerned, I think Russia has got a moral responsibility of assisting, as I said earlier on, as best it could. And in fact, this is some kind of reparation. I did indicate that, when we started with this conversation. And this is how far it should really go. And I even suggested that in as far as South Africa, for instance, is concerned, this relationship, I see it growing even beyond 2024, which is the year of our general elections, because it was based on this moral understanding and obligation between two sister countries.
We have come to an era where a lot of people are demanding African solutions to African problems. You talk about the moral responsibility of Russia, but is Africa strong enough? I mean, we have lots of countries in Africa to deal with their own issues without the intervention of either the Western powers or Russia. How strong is Africa to actually deal with its own issues squarely?
You see, we have the AU, which was preceded by the Organization of African Unity. And it has always been a cry that Africa, let us be united in solving our own African problems in our own African way. And I think that for me, I would certainly like to see the AU playing a much, much, much bigger role than just talking. If we were to go back in history and appreciate what people like Nyerere, people like Kwame Nkrumah, and people like O.R. Tambo himself, as well as Robert Sobukwe, when they spoke about one united Africa, and they spoke about United States of Africa. That's very key for me, because right now we've got about 54 countries which make the continent of Africa. And when you look at these 54 states, you find out each one of them has got its own currency. And yet, if we were to have a United States of Africa and remove these artificial boundaries, which artificial boundaries were created by the 1884 Berlin Congress, Africa would be a strong united continent. And of course, recognize that if we go that route of an African Union and an Organization of African Unity as the precursor to AU, Africa would be a very strong country. Because, I mean, right now we've got small nuggets of countries which make up the African continent. Why not be the same as the United States of America, for instance? Okay. You know, that is my own view. That is the route which the African continent really needs to consider very, very seriously. All right. Because, I mean, if we go that route, let me just say, if we go that route, I strongly believe that we as Africans, we will have the guts and the gumption of solving our own African problems in our own African way of thinking and in our own African intelligentsia.
All right, thank you so much, Professor Gordon Gide. We'll go for a quick break right now. We're still examining all the Russia's influence in Africa. And of course, we talk about how Africa can be strong. The United States of Africa, Africa defending its own continent. Do stay with us, it's still one slot. Thanks for staying with us in one slot. We're still examining Russia's growing influence in Africa. And staying with us in one slot is Professor Gordon Gide, a Pan-Africanist, retired Vice Chancellor and Principal of the Vaal University of Technology, and the current CEO and founder of Gigelty PT Limited, who joined us from Vanderbijlpark, Gauteng, South Africa. Thank you so much once again for joining us, Professor Gide, on one slot. So before we went on break, we were discussing Africa's growing relationship. We talked about a possible United States of Africa. But looking at present realities, we see that Russia is definitely not in the good graces of Western powers if you look at the Russia-Ukraine conflict at the moment. So how much of this has impacted Russia's need for Africa as an ally?
Well, certainly, let's the issue, for instance, of Ukraine and Russia, it has in one way or the other impacted negatively on the economy of our country, and in fact even the economy of the continent. But of course, one would have not to enter into the debate about the conflict between Russia and Ukraine. I think it's got its own political dynamics. But certainly, in as far as that war, unwarranted as it is, has affected the economy of the country, of the continent, it certainly has. But evidently, you know, when one looks at the whole Ukraine and Russia war, one can easily reflect on China's influence, for instance, in Africa. You'll find that quite a number of Chinese industrial relations are now coming on board Africa, for the Chinese to help develop some parts of Africa. And so this is the extent to which I believe Russia is trying to do exactly that, notwithstanding, as I said, the war between Russia and Ukraine. War is war. There is no doubt that one can really say we promote war. War has never been a a solution to problems. It can always be a cordial working dialogue between countries to solve their problems. And so, yes, if Russia and Ukraine could sit down as they try to do, that would be fine. But I think that the war has impacted negatively on the economy of the country, particularly in terms of the energy crisis we are faced with in our part of the continent, for instance. And so, yes, I think there's a sense in which we can not deny the fact that the war has had some negative impact on the continent, not only in South Africa, but generally in Africa as a continent.
Still talking about how this affects Africa. I mean, according to the African Development World Bank, the Russia-Ukraine conflict drove the prices of wheat, a staple food across the continent, up by nearly 60% due to shortages. Now, we see that both Russia and Ukraine are responsible for 44% of Africa's wheat consumption. Now, how much dependency, economic dependency, does Africa have on Russia?
That is very true. But again, you see, when we're talking about the 60% of corn wheat which Russia is producing and helping Africa with, that is fine. But I want us to go back to the reasons why we are in that crisis. Before the division of Africa, into these little states, Africa has always been a self-sufficient continent. I did indicate earlier on that before the Berlin Congress, all these artificial boundaries were not there, and Africa was very strong. But of course, with the demarcation, now it brought Africa to almost its knees, if I may use that language, because right now you've got Mali, you've got Ghana, you've got Sudan, you've got Ethiopia, this and that and the other. Whereas that demarcation and division has really weakened Africa. As a result of that, that is why there is so much import and export. Now, the European countries, it is some of them, let me not generalize, have actually taken upon themselves to come into Africa, steal African resources for their own benefit, and therefore, in turn, sell the material back to Africa at a very high price. If you take the maize and the corn and the wheat and you name it, these were African products, which with the passage of time, of course, the superpowers came in, this and that and the other. And so this is where, unfortunately, we're finding ourselves in. But were it not the Berlin Congress, I don't think that we as a continent would be where we are currently. We would be far ahead. But let us accept the fact that we are in this situation because of what happened, which will take years and years to rebuild the Africa we want. And finally, let me just say to you that you would remember the statement made by, and I think that it was, I don't think it was Nyerere, maybe it was Kwame Nkrumah, I think it was Nkrumah, who said, "Seek ye first political freedom and the rest shall follow." And I think this is where we really need to locate our future as the African continent, that we have now political freedom, but what about economic freedom? This is the basis of building a sustainable African continent.
Okay, now, Professor Zide, still you're talking about seeking first political freedom. I mean, if we go back to South Africa, which I'm sure you're familiar with, and still going back a bit to the Russia-Ukraine conflict, South Africa has faced a lot of criticism. I mean, we're seeing lots of African countries, some abstaining from the vote of no confidence against Russia, and while some are still having lots of ties with Russia, even as Russia faces a vote of no confidence from the UN Security Council. So where exactly do you place South Africa? Is it from neutrality with Russia, or is it still trying to have a safe relationship with Russia due to what exactly it's gaining?
Well, Rita, it's actually twofold. It's twofold. Number one, South Africa has got its own domestic problems. We can't run away from the fact that we've got our own domestic problems. But having our own domestic problems does not necessarily suggest that we can do away with the diplomatic relations which South Africa has and has built with Russia. In fact, what we need to do is to strengthen such relationships. And so, yes, we have our own domestic problems, but as far as the vote of no confidence, imposed on Russia by Security Council, I think that it is the mandate of the Security Council to decide or not to decide whom to work with and who not to work with. But certainly, we as a country, at least from where I'm not in government, so let me not appear as if I'm talking on behalf of the government. But I think my own political analysis is that, remember this is what I said even earlier on, that the relationship between South Africa and Russia was built on a firm moral foundation by the founders of the democracy which we enjoy today, i.e. Nelson Mandela, as well as O.R. Tambo, who actually approached Russia for military assistance. And so that relationship, in my view, cannot be done away with overnight. I mean, even if after the 2024 elections, say a worst case scenario, the ANC loses power, and I don't think that such relations with Russia will automatically come to an end. I don't think so. In fact, what would happen even if the ANC loses power next year, whatever government is going to come in place, which will probably be a coalition, the relations which have been built over a number of years will be strengthened, to say the least. They will be strengthened and to find a better way in which they can be mutually beneficial to South Africa and whatever country, in this instance, Russia.
Okay, Professor Zide, I'm trying to really understand if Africa's dependency, I mean, when you look at the economy, you talked about why Africa got to where it was and why we're so much dependent on Russia and Ukraine. Now, in late October, Vladimir Putin underscored the fact that Russia was looking for its Soviet-era allies and non-Western friends for creating a new world order. Now, what exactly are the implications from historical perspectives relating to Africa?
Yeah. Well, I think that what would happen is that that new political order, which would cater the interests of the African continent, would be what would be beneficial for both Russia as well as the African continent. Like, for instance, if we're looking at number one, what is in the best interests of the continent? Is it military assistance? Is it higher education assistance? Or is it health? We all know that Africa, for some very strange reasons, has always been a continent which lacks in health facilities. And so the relationship, in my view, will be founded on what Russia can assist in terms of health provision, as well as in terms of education. If, for instance, you take the South African situation into consideration, some of our doctors have, for instance, been trained in Cuba. We know the footprints of Russia in Cuba. So this is the extent to which I believe that we would be able to find one another between Russia and South Africa in the promotion of health, in the promotion of education, and in the promotion of the worst case scenario. And I don't want even to go there, the military, assistance, because when I said earlier on that war is war, there is no better way of describing the brutality of war. We have seen it, happening in Russia and Ukraine. It is devastating. I mean, I once visited on 3 occasions Somalia, and I saw the devastation of war, and I would not like to see that happening even to my West country. The war is terrible. Okay. It is not something that we should entertain.
Now, from what you're saying, there's a bit of optimism with Russia's relationship with Africa, but some school of thoughts believe that this partnership with Russia seeks in Africa and not state but elite base. Now, what do you make of this? And do you actually believe that this relationship has been welcomed by illegitimate and unpopular leaders trying to retain power? Because earlier on, you talked about political freedom in Africa. So do you feel that there's a correlation between these leaders who are legitimate, trying to retain power, and your relationship with Russia?
Rita, you would always find opportunists in any situation. Remember, we spoke about coups in Africa, and we spoke about the third-party forces. We spoke about some leaders wanting to remain in power at all costs. Now, the picture you are painting is really spot on. There are, unfortunately, African leaders who would want to remain in power at whatever cost. And this is a very painful historical perspective of what is happening in our continent. It is unfortunate. And so, based on that painful historical perspective, there is an element of opportunism. There's an element of opportunism where some leaders who know that themselves that they are illegitimate and do not know at what time in their history we should really hand over the baton and say, look, I have done my best. I think time has come now for me just to step aside and allow the new generation to come in. You will always find opportunists, and you will always find people not being prepared to step aside or to step down, they want to remain in power in order to sit, I dare say, on their corrupt activities. They will sit in power and even want to die in power. So, yes, there are those people. And unfortunately, this is a syndrome which is killing the African leadership, unfortunately, and dancing according to the music of some superpowers out there. Remember, I earlier spoke about third influence in any political situation. So this is exactly what you are saying. You are referring to opportunist and opportunism. I agree with you that yes, there is that element.
All right, thank you.
And of course, some countries will take advantage of that because they want to serve their own interests and not the interests of the majority.
All right, thank you so much, Professor Gordon Zide. A lot of things, intricacies with the relationship between Russia and Africa. Thank you so much. Pan-Africanist, retired Vice Chancellor and Principal of the VAR University of Technology, and the current CEO and founder of Gigelti. Thank you so much for joining us on this conversation.
Thank you very much, Rita. Much appreciated.
Thank you.